She just wanted to help, but he wasn't just any drunk. The poor girl reached out her hand, not knowing who was on the ground. The man lying there was a millionaire, running away from everything and everyone. What happened next changed both of their destinies forever. The millionaire's heart. The millionaire saw a mother with triplets shivering in the storm. With his heart touched, he gave his entire mansion to the four of them. Months later, he returned to visit the house he had donated, and what he found inside made him turn pale with shock. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. The rain beat against the bulletproof windows of the Rolls-Royce as Richard Montgomery reviewed the latest reports. On his tablet, droplets slid down the window like silent tears, creating a translucent veil between him and the outside world. The traffic light turned red, forcing the vehicle to stop on one of New York City's busiest avenues. The clock showed 6:45 a.m. Like every day for the past 15 years, Richard followed his meticulously calculated routine. At 45, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming himself into one of the country's most successful businessmen. His austere face and penetrating gaze revealed a personality shaped by discipline and absolute control over every aspect of his life. The driver, John, maintained a respectful silence as always. The relationship between the two was purely professional, but there was an unquestionable loyalty built over the years. John was one of the few employees who knew the true solitary nature of his boss. A sudden movement outside caught Richard's attention. Through the curtain of rain, his eyes found a scene that paralyzed him. A young woman, completely soaked, was hugging three small children. They were identical, triplets. She was trying to protect them with a thin coat that was visibly inadequate for that downpour. The children were trembling, their little faces marked by a mixture of fear and helplessness. Something in the desperate expression of the woman, in the way she tried to embrace all three at once, caused a crack in Richard's emotional armor. People passed by hurriedly, some bumping into the small group, others swerving with indifference. No one stopped, no one looked. "John, stop the car," ordered Richard, his normally controlled voice betraying a slight tremor. The driver, surprised by the break in routine, promptly obeyed. Richard opened the door, protecting himself with a black umbrella. He approached the group with firm steps, but his expression had changed. There was something different in his eyes, a vulnerability long forgotten. "Ma'am," he called, his voice softer than usual. "Do you need help?" The woman raised her eyes, revealing a young face marked by fatigue and worry. Her dark brown hair stuck to her wet face, and her hands trembled as she held the children. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, with a dignity that contrasted with her precarious situation. Richard observed the children more carefully. They must have been about 4 years old. Three identical boys with large, frightened eyes clinging to their mother's soaked skirt. Something in that scene transported him to a distant past, a time that he struggled to keep locked away in some obscure place in his memory. "Please," he insisted, "let me help. I have a car here, and I can take you to a safe place until the rain passes." The woman hesitated, her gaze alternating between the well-dressed stranger and her shivering children. One of the boys coughed, and that sound seemed to decide for her. "I'm Lucy," she introduced herself, still cautiously. "And these are Michael, Ethan, and Ryan." Richard gestured toward the car where John was already waiting with the door open. "Richard Montgomery," he responded simply. "Let's get out of this rain first, then we'll talk." As he helped Lucy and the children into the vehicle, Richard didn't notice the discreet flash of a camera going off from one of the windows of the building across the street. Nor did he notice the attentive gaze of his housekeeper, Helen, who was observing everything from her own apartment in the same building where he lived. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly over the wet asphalt, carrying that impromptu group toward Richard's penthouse. In the back seat, the children gradually stopped shivering, their curious eyes exploring the luxurious interior of the vehicle. Lucy remained silent, but her eyes revealed a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Richard observed the scene through the rearview mirror, feeling something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He couldn't name that feeling, But something told him that his life, so meticulously organized, was about to change forever. Richard's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of one of New York City's most exclusive buildings. The environment, decorated in shades of gray and white, reflected its owner's personality, minimalist, organized, and impeccable. When the group entered, the contrast between the aseptic luxury of the apartment and the soaked figures was striking. Helen, the housekeeper who had worked for Richard for more than a decade, observed the scene with a mixture of surprise and mistrust. In 15 years, she had never seen her boss bring unexpected visitors, much less an entire family. Something in her gaze revealed that this break in routine deeply disturbed her. "Helen, prepare towels and dry clothes for our guests," ordered Richard, his voice maintaining the professional tone as always, "and provide a hearty breakfast." The housekeeper nodded in silence, but her eyes lingered on Lucy for a few seconds longer than necessary. There was something calculating in her expression, as if she were assessing a potential threat. Lucy, still uncomfortable with the situation, tried to keep the triplets close. The boys, however, were already beginning to show curiosity about the new environment. Michael, the most observant of the 3, couldn't take his eyes off Richard. Ethan explored the space with his gaze, while Ryan, the shyest, remained glued to his mother. "You can use the guest room to change," indicated Richard, pointing to a hallway. "Helen will bring dry clothes in a moment." While Lucy and the children were being led to the room, Richard headed to his office. He needed to reorganize his schedule. For the first time in years, he felt that there was something more important than his morning meetings. Seated at his desk, he observed the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rain continued to fall, creating hypnotic patterns on the glass. His cell phone vibrated, a message. Upon opening it, his body instantly tensed. It was a photo taken a few minutes ago, showing Lucy and the triplets sitting on the couch in his living room, wrapped in blankets that Helen had just provided. The caption was short but disturbing. "Do you know who they are?" Richard rose abruptly. The photo could only have been taken from inside the apartment. His security system was impenetrable, which meant that the person responsible had access to the place. The list of suspects was short, very short. At that moment, Helen entered the office without knocking, something she had never done before. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to talk." Her voice was laden with unusual urgency. Richard faced his housekeeper, noticing for the first time how her eyes seemed to know more than they showed. "Yes, Helen, we do indeed." "That woman," Helen began, but Richard interrupted her with a gesture. "First, I want you to explain this," he said, showing the photo on his cell phone. Helen's face paled for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, I took the photo, and I did it for your own good, sir. You don't know these people, you don't know who they are or what they want." Richard felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he controlled it, as he always did with his emotions. "And you do?" "I know enough to be concerned," replied Helen, her voice taking on a protective tone that sounded almost maternal. "You built all this from nothing. You can't let—" A noise coming from the living room interrupted the conversation. It was the sound of children's laughter, a sound that had never echoed off those walls. Richard and Helen headed to the living room where they found a surprising scene. Ryan, the quietest triplet, was sitting at the grand piano that decorated the room, his small hands sliding over the keys with natural curiosity. Lucy, now dressed in borrowed dry clothes, was trying to pull the boy away from the instrument. "I'm sorry," she said, visibly embarrassed. "He's fascinated by music." Richard observed the scene, feeling that strange sensation in his chest again. "Let him," he said, surprising everyone, including himself. "The piano needs life. It's been still for too long." Helen watched, everything with an increasingly concerned look. She had known her boss for enough years to realize that something was changing, and changes, in her experience, rarely brought anything good. At that moment, Richard didn't know it, but he was about to discover that that rainy morning was just the beginning of a story that would change not only his life, but that of everyone around him. And as the disorganized notes from the piano echoed through the penthouse, deeper mysteries began to form, like dark clouds on the horizon. Breakfast was served in the spacious dining room, where the tempered glass table reflected the soft light that was beginning to penetrate the clouds. Helen had prepared a veritable banquet: fresh bread, fruits, natural juices, eggs, and a variety of cheeses. The triplets, now dry and warm, looked in wonder at so much food. Richard, seated at the head of the table, discreetly observed as Lucy helped the boys serve themselves. There was a delicacy in her gestures, particular attention to each child, even though they were identical. She knew their preferences, their small differences. Michael preferred fruit cut into smaller pieces. Ethan always asked for more juice. And Ryan, the quietest, would only eat if his mother tasted it first. "You were a lawyer," Richard said, suddenly breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Lucy raised her eyes, surprised. "How did you know?" "Your posture, your way of speaking, the manner in which you carefully choose your words," he replied, taking a sip of coffee. "And there's one detail. When you entered the apartment, your eyes immediately located the emergency exits. It's a common habit among legal professionals." A sad smile passed over Lucy's lips. "I was, yes. A long time ago. Before..." "Before? The boys?" Richard completed, maintaining a neutral tone. "Before everything changed," she replied, her gaze losing itself for a moment in memories that seemed too painful to share. Helen, who was serving more coffee, didn't disguise her interest. In the conversation, her attentive eyes registered each word, each gesture, as if she were assembling an invisible puzzle. "Mommy was the best," Ethan suddenly exclaimed, surprising everyone. "Grandpa always said she was going to be a judge one day." Lucy's face visibly paled at the mention of Grandpa. Richard noticed the change in her expression, but before he could question it, Michael began to cough violently. The boy had choked on a piece of bread. Richard reacted instinctively, rising to help, but Helen was faster. With precise movements, she helped the boy recover. When everything calmed down, there was something different in the housekeeper's gaze, a flash of genuine emotion that contrasted with her usual reserve. "We need to go," said Lucy, rising abruptly. "We've already imposed too much on your hospitality." "You have nowhere to go," stated Richard. Again, it wasn't a question. Lucy hesitated, her eyes meeting his. There was a silent struggle there. Pride against concern, mistrust against need. "Stay," he said, surprising himself. "At least until you find a safe place." "Why are you doing this?" asked Lucy, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard stood and walked to the window. The city stretched below, a labyrinth of buildings and avenues where thousands of stories unfolded simultaneously. Because 25 years ago, on a morning like this, no one stopped to help a boy who also had nowhere to go. The silence that followed his declaration was heavy, loaded with unspoken meanings. Helen, who partially knew her boss's story, let out an almost inaudible sigh. "The guest room is yours for as long as you need it," continued Richard, still with his back to the group. "Helen will provide everything necessary." The housekeeper opened her mouth to protest, but a look from Richard silenced her. She nodded stiffly and left the room, her steps echoing on the marble floor. Ryan, who had been quiet until then, rose from his chair and walked over to Richard. To everyone's amazement, especially Lucy's, the boy held the businessman's hand. It was a simple gesture, almost imperceptible but loaded with inexplicable trust. "Thank you," said the boy, his voice so low that only Richard could hear. At that moment, something inside the businessman, something he had buried decades, ego beneath layers of success and self-discipline, began to stir. It was as if a long-locked door was slowly beginning to open. On the other side of the city, in a luxurious office, a gray-haired man observed a computer screen. On it, a series of photos showed Lucy and the triplets entering Richard Montgomery's car. His eyes, cold as ice, narrowed as he picked up the phone. "I found them," he said simply, "and you won't believe where they are." The morning advanced, and with it, the gears of destiny began to move. In Richard's penthouse, between cups of coffee and hesitant smiles, no one realized they were being watched. And that very soon, the past that everyone was trying to leave behind would come to collect its price. The afternoon was falling over New York City when Richard finally returned to his office in the penthouse. He had cancelled all of his meetings for the day, something unprecedented in his career, and dedicated the last few hours to making arrangements for his unexpected guests. Now, seated in his Italian leather armchair, he tried to organize his thoughts as he observed the city through the panoramic windows. The soft sound of knocking on the door interrupted his contemplation. It was Helen, carrying an old folder and a worried expression on her face. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, closing the door behind her, "there's something you need to see." Richard gestured for her to approach. Helen placed the folder on his desk and opened it, revealing a series of carefully preserved newspaper clippings. "I researched our guest," explained the housekeeper, her voice assuming a professional tone. "Lucy Mendez Almeida. She was a promising lawyer until 5 years ago when she married Edward Williams." The name made Richard raise his eyebrows. The Williams were one of the country's most influential families, known both for their economic power and their political connections. "Edward was the youngest son of Augustus Williams," continued Helen, pointing to a newspaper photo that showed an elegant man with graying hair. "The family patriarch was?" questioned Richard, noting the use of the past tense. Helen nodded gravely. "Edward suffered a car accident shortly after the triplets were born. Since then, Lucy has disappeared from public life. There are rumors that Augustus Williams blames her for what happened, and..." A noise coming from the living room interrupted the conversation. It was the sound of the piano again, but this time the notes formed a recognizable melody. An old lullaby. Richard and Helen exchanged surprised glances before heading to the living room. They found Ryan sitting at the piano, his small hands moving with surprising dexterity over the keys. Lucy was by his side, her eyes moist, while Michael and Ethan listened sitting on the floor. "I'm sorry," said Lucy upon noticing their presence. "Edward used to play this song for them to sleep." Richard observed the scene with a strange sensation in his chest. "Did he teach them to play?" "No," replied Lucy, her voice choked. "Ryan learned by himself, listening to his father. He has a natural gift for music." Helen discreetly cleared her throat, drawing Richard's attention. There was more in the folder she had brought, more secrets to be revealed, but something in his gaze made her understand that this wasn't the moment. The rest of the afternoon passed in an improvised routine. Helen, still visibly distrustful, but now with an almost maternal interest in the triplets, organized a snack and activities for the children. Richard tried to work in his office, but his thoughts kept returning to the family in his living room. It was already night when his cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made his blood freeze. "Get out of this story while you can, Montgomery. You don't know who you're dealing with." Almost simultaneously, he heard a scream coming from the guest room. He ran there, finding Lucy pale, holding an envelope that someone had slipped under the door. Inside it were old photos. Lucy with Edward, both smiling in front of a courthouse, the newly born triplets in the hospital, and a last, more recent image showing Lucy and the children entering Richard's car that morning. "He found us," she whispered, trembling. "Augustus always finds us." Richard took the photos, studying them carefully. His analytical mind was already working on possible solutions, security measures, protection strategies. But there was something more, something he couldn't ignore. A protective instinct he hadn't felt since never. "No one is going to hurt you," he declared, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even himself. "Not while you're under my protection." At that moment, Helen appeared at the door, her face tense. "Sir, there's something else you need to know about the Williams," she said hesitantly. "Something I found in the company's old archives." Richard nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Lucy and the children. The past and present were about to collide, and he knew that the next few hours would be crucial. In the city below, the lights were beginning to turn on, like earthly stars guiding the way through the approaching darkness. Richard's office was immersed in semi-darkness when Helen returned with an even older folder than the previous one. The yellowed paper and stains of time revealed documents from at least 2 decades ago. The housekeeper deposited the material on the desk with almost reverential care. "I found this in the company's old archives," she began, her voice softer than usual. "These are records from the time when you were still building your empire. There's something here about the Williams that might explain a lot." Richard opened the folder cautiously. The first page was a partnership contract dated 20 years. Jargo signed by him and by Augustus Williams. His hands trembled slightly as he recognized his own signature, so different from his current one. "I was his partner," murmured Richard, more to himself than to Helen. "For a brief period," confirmed the housekeeper, "before he tried to take control of the company you were building. It was your first major business battle." The memories started to return like flashes. Sleepless nights, piles of documents, tense meetings. Richard had managed to maintain control of his nascent company, but the emotional cost had been high. After that episode, he had closed himself off even more from the world, transforming his solitude into a fortress. "Augustus never forgave me for winning," stated Richard, leafing through more documents. "But that was so long ago." "There's more," interrupted Helen, pulling out a newspaper clipping. "Edward Williams, Lucy's husband, was a lawyer for your company at the time of the accident. He was investigating some irregularities in his own father's business." The weight of that revelation fell like an avalanche on Richard. His hands instinctively reached for the water bottle on the desk, but before he could reach it, he heard a child's voice coming from the door. "You knew my father?" It was Michael, the most observant of the triplets, standing in the doorway with his large, curious eyes. Richard and Helen exchanged concerned looks, but before they could respond, Lucy appeared behind her son. "Michael, you shouldn't be here," she said softly, but her gaze was fixed on the documents spread across the desk. "Your husband," began. Richard, choosing his words carefully, was a man of principles. Lucy approached, her eyes recognizing the old papers. "Edward always said there were too many secrets in the Williams family, dangerous secrets." "Mommy," called Michael, pulling at the hem of her blouse, "why doesn't Grandpa like it when you talk about Daddy?" The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Helen discreetly led Michael out of the office, leaving Richard and Lucy alone with the shadows of the past that were beginning to take shape. "Edward discovered something," said Lucy, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something about Augustus's business dealings. He was gathering evidence, documents. Then that night..." Her voice failed, and Richard realized there was more to that story than he had imagined. The accident that took Edward's life might not have been just an accident. "Why did you never report it?" he asked, watching her carefully. "Because he has so much power," replied Lucy, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "And because he swore that if I tried anything, I would never see my children again." At that moment, a sound of breaking glass came from the living room, followed by the frightened cry of one of the children. Richard and Lucy ran out of the office, finding a disturbing scene. The large living room window was shattered, and in the midst of the glass shards was a rock with a note tied to it. Helen was already there, embracing Ethan and Ryan, while Michael hid behind the piano. Richard picked up the note with steady hands, but his heart accelerated as he read the contents. "Last chance, Montgomery. Tomorrow may be too late." "How is this possible?" questioned Helen, her voice trembling for the first time in years. "We're on the 30th floor." Richard walked to the broken window, observing the night city below. Someone had managed to bypass his entire security system, someone with resources and determination. The war that had begun 20 years ago was about to restart, but now there was much more at stake. "Lucy," he called without turning around, "I need you to tell me everything. Every detail of what Edward discovered. I can't protect you if I don't know what we're fighting against." The cold night wind invaded the apartment through the broken window, making the curtains dance like ghosts. In the city below, lights blinked like earthly stars, silent witnesses to a story that was beginning to reveal its deepest and darkest layers. The early morning hours advanced as the security team finished installing a temporary protection for the broken window. Richard had activated his best contacts, and in a matter of hours, the penthouse had been transformed into a veritable fortress. Extra cameras were installed, motion sensors activated, and a private security team began monitoring every inch of the building. In the apartment's library, temporarily transformed into a meeting room, Lucy was seated in a leather armchair, her hands clutching a cup of tea that Helen had prepared. The triplets were finally asleep in the guest room, exhausted after the scare. "Edward began to suspect something was wrong about 6 years ago," began Lucy, her voice low but firm. "He was responsible for the internal audit of the Williams companies. At first they were just small inconsistencies, numbers that didn't add up." Richard listened attentively, seated at his desk, while Helen took notes on an iPad. The housekeeper had transformed into an unexpected ally, her initial distrust replaced by an iron determination to protect the children. "Then he discovered the offshore accounts," continued Lucy. "Millions being transferred to tax havens, shell companies, inflated contracts. But the worst wasn't that. There were connections with powerful people, politicians, judges. That's why Augustus had so much power to threaten you," concluded Richard, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. "Edward kept everything on a flash drive," said Lucy, her voice trembling slightly. "He gave it to me on the night of the accident, saying it was life insurance for me and the children." Helen raised her eyes from the iPad, her expression suddenly alert. "And where is this flash drive now?" Before Lucy could respond, a soft sound came from the hallway. It was Ryan standing in the library doorway in his new pajamas, hugging a teddy bear that Helen had found in an old closet. "Can't sleep, little one?" asked Richard, his tone surprisingly gentle. Ryan shook his head negatively and walked over to him. To everyone's amazement, he climbed onto the businessman's lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Richard tensed for a moment, but soon found himself relaxing with the weight of the child in his arms. "Are you going to protect us?" asked Ryan, his voice sleepy but clear. The question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. It was the first time he had heard the boy's voice so distinctly, and there was something in that childish confidence that broke his last barriers. "I will," he replied, with a certainty that came from the depth of his soul. "I promise." Lucy observed the scene with tears in her eyes, while Helen discreetly wiped her own. The moment was interrupted by Richard's cell phone, which vibrated with a message. It was a photo of the flash drive, accompanied by GPS coordinates and a message: "Come alone or the next photos will be less pleasant." Richard felt Ryan fall asleep in his arms as he studied the message. His analytical mind was already drawing up plans, calculating risks, considering alternatives. But there was something different now, a motivation that went beyond the cold logic of business. "Helen," he called softly, "prepare the master bedroom for Lucy and the children. It's safer than the guest room." The housekeeper nodded, understanding the strategy. The master bedroom had a hidden panic room, equipped with everything necessary for an emergency. "And what about the flash drive?" asked Lucy, the concern evident in her voice. "Leave that to me," replied Richard, adjusting Ryan in his arms to carry him back to bed. "I have some contacts who can help us without raising suspicions." As he walked down the hallway with the sleeping boy, Richard reflected on how his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. His meticulous routine, his emotional walls, his self-imposed solitude, everything was being challenged by the presence of this unexpected family. In the bedroom, he found Michael and Ethan also awake, waiting for their brother. As he placed Ryan in the bed, he felt small hands holding his sleeve. "Stay a little longer," asked Ethan, his large, pleading eyes. Richard hesitated for a moment, years of emotional isolation fighting against something new growing in his chest. Then, for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to sit on the edge of the bed and began to tell a story, the same one he had heard long ago on an equally frightening night when he was just a boy in an orphanage. Morning arrived with a deceptive gentleness, the winter sun penetrating through the penthouse's bulletproof windows. Richard had been in his office since the early hours, his eyes fixed on the computer screen as he coordinated a silent operation. His hands flew over the keyboard, activating contacts, moving resources, preparing for what was to come. Helen entered, noiselessly, carrying a tray with fresh coffee. Her experienced eyes immediately noticed the signs that her boss hadn't slept: the slightly loose tie, the slightly disheveled hair, the computer screen reflecting dozens of emails sent during the night. "The boys asked for you at breakfast," she said, her voice carrying a note of affection that surprised even herself, especially Ryan. "He wanted to know if you would tell more stories." Richard paused his work for a moment, allowing himself a small smile. "How are they?" "Adapting surprisingly well," replied Helen, serving the coffee. "Michael has discovered your library and is fascinated with the art books. Ethan doesn't stop exploring the apartment, asking 1,000 questions about everything. And Russian, well, he spends hours at the piano, playing melodies that seem to come from nowhere." A familiar sound filled the air, as if to confirm Helen's words. It was Ryan at the piano, his small hands creating a melody that seemed to dance between sadness and hope. "He has an extraordinary gift," commented Richard, rising to observe the boy through the office door. "I need to arrange a music teacher for him." Helen raised her eyebrows, surprised by the long-term planning implicit in that statement. "Do you intend to keep them here for that long?" Before Richard could respond, Lucy appeared at the door, her eyes revealing that she too hadn't slept much. "May I come in?" Richard made an affirmative gesture, and Helen discreetly withdrew, not without first exchanging a meaningful look with her boss. "I found this morning," said Lucy, extending a yellowed envelope. "It was hidden inside the teddy bear that Ryan has been carrying." Richard opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter from Edward, dated the day of his accident, and a small golden key. "It's a key to a safe deposit box," explained Lucy, her voice trembling slightly. "Edward had a box at the bank, but he never told me what he kept there. In the letter, he mentions that there is evidence that can change everything." Richard studied the key carefully. "Which bank?" "I don't know," replied Lucy, running her hands through her hair in a gesture of frustration. "Edward was very careful with sensitive information. He said that the less I knew, the safer I would be." The sound of the piano stopped abruptly, replaced by animated children's voices. Michael and Ethan had joined their brother, and now the three were conversing in their particular triplet language. "They're so alike," commented Richard, observing the children, "but so different at the same time." "How do you manage to differentiate them so easily?" asked Lucy, genuinely curious. "Even my own family sometimes gets confused." Richard reflected for a moment. "Michael has an analytical look, always observing everything. Ethan is pure energy, can't stay still. And Ryan, he lives in his own world of music and dreams." Lucy stared at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You really see them, don't you, as individuals?" "Perhaps because I was also an invisible child once," he replied almost without realizing it. The moment was interrupted by Helen, who returned hurriedly to the office. "Sir, there's something you need to see, on television." Richard turned. On the plasma TV on the wall, tuning to the news channel indicated by Helen. His heart froze when he saw the headline, "Businessman Richard Montgomery under investigation for suspected financial irregularities." The report showed old photos of him with Augustus Williams, suggesting an alleged criminal partnership that had been covered up for years. It was a carefully constructed story to appear true, mixing real facts with elaborate lies. "It's begun," murmured Richard, his mind already calculating the next move. "He's trying to discredit us before we can use the evidence from the safe deposit box." Lucy paled, understanding the implications. Edward predicted this. In the letter, he mentions that Augustus would try to destroy anyone who threatened to expose the truth. At that moment, Michael entered the office carrying one of the library books. "Look what I found," he exclaimed, showing an old photo that had fallen from between the pages. The photo showed a group of children in front of an orphanage. Richard immediately recognized his own young face, but there was something else that caught his attention. In the background, partially visible, was a man he knew very well, Augustus Williams. "Impossible," he whispered, taking the photo with trembling hands. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a way he could never have imagined. Silence in the office was as dense as fog as Richard studied the old photograph. His fingers traced the contours of the figures, memories long buried emerging like bubbles in deep water. St. Francis Orphanage, where he spent part of his childhood, had been funded by the Williams Foundation, a detail that now gained an entirely new meaning. "Helen," he called without taking his eyes off the photo, "bring me all the records you can find about the Williams Foundation between 1990 and 1995. The housekeeper nodded and left quickly, while Lucy approached to examine the image. Edward once mentioned that Augustus had a special social project, something he kept secret even from his own children. "It wasn't a social project," replied Richard, his voice laden with a sudden and disturbing understanding. "It was a laboratory." Before he could elaborate, the sound of hurried footsteps came from the hallway. It was Ethan running toward the office with a panicked expression. "Ryan is gone," he exclaimed, breathless. "We were playing hide and seek, but we've looked everywhere." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. In seconds, the entire building's security system was activated. Cameras were checked, guards mobilized, every inch of the building methodically searched. "The hallway cameras," murmured Helen, who had returned with a folder of documents, "show the last 2 hours." On the computer screen, the images revealed something disturbing. Ryan had entered the service elevator alone, apparently following the sound of music coming from somewhere. The elevator descended to the basement, where the camera caught only a shadow moving quickly before the image was interrupted. "Does he have the bear?" asked Richard suddenly, turning to Ethan. The boy shook his head negatively. "He left it in the living room near the piano." Richard ran to the living room, followed by everyone. The teddy bear had fallen near the piano bench, as if it had been left in a hurry. He picked it up, examining it carefully until he found something sewn into the lining, a small paper with handwritten numbers. "These are coordinates," he said, recognizing the pattern, "and a safe deposit box number." "Edward's safe deposit box," exclaimed Lucy, understanding. "But how did Ryan—" "It wasn't a coincidence," interrupted Richard, his hands already typing commands on his cell phone. "The bear, the music, everything was planned. Augustus knew the safe deposit box existed, but he didn't have the key. Now he has something more valuable." "My son," whispered Lucy, her voice breaking. Michael, who had been quiet until then, pulled on Richard's sleeve. "I know where he is," he said with surprising certainty. Everyone turned to the boy, who continued, "Ryan always follows the music, and yesterday when we were exploring the building, we heard a piano coming from the ballroom in the basement." "It's a trap," warned Helen, but Richard was already moving. "Of course it is," he replied, picking up his phone. "That's why we're not going alone." With a few quick commands, he activated his private security team and made a call to someone he kept in reserve for extreme situations, an ex-federal agent who owed him favors. "Lucy, you and Michael stay here with Helen," he instructed, his voice not admitting arguments. "Ethan comes with me." "Why?" questioned Lucy, protesting. "Because Ryan trusts Ethan more than any of us," explained Richard. "If he's scared, he'll need his brother." As the elevator descended to the basement, Richard held Ethan's hand firmly. The boy, surprisingly calm, looked up with complete confidence in his eyes. "You're going to bring him back, right?" asked Ethan. "I will," replied Richard, and for the second time that day, he made a promise he intended to keep at any cost. The elevator stopped, and the doors opened to the dimness of the basement. From somewhere came the soft sound of a piano, the same melody that Ryan used to play, but there was something different about it, something metallic and artificial. Richard squeezed Ethan's hand lightly, a gesture of mutual reassurance. Together, they took the first step out of the elevator, toward the sound that called them, while the shadows of the past and present mingled in the damp air of the basement. The basement ballroom was a spacious and elegant area, normally used for sophisticated events. That morning, however, the environment had something surreal about it. The piano music echoed off the mirrored walls, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Richard and Ethan advanced cautiously, their shadows infinitely multiplied by the mirrors. "Ryan," called Ethan, his childish voice breaking the hypnotic spell of the melody. The sound of the piano ceased abruptly. In the silence that followed, they could hear soft footsteps coming from the back of the ballroom. A figure emerged from the dimness. It wasn't Ryan, but Helen, her expression a mask of guilt and determination. "I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I had no choice." Richard instinctively placed Ethan behind him. "Where is Ryan?" "He's safe," replied a deep and familiar voice. Augustus Williams emerged from behind one of the pillars, his impeccable suit contrasting with the hard expression on his aged face. "As he's always been under my care." "Your care?" questioned Richard, his mind quickly connecting the pieces of the puzzle. "Like I was at the orphanage." Augustus smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You were always the brightest of them, Richard, the most successful project of the Foundation." Ethan squeezed Richard's hand harder, while Helen moved uncomfortably beside Augustus. "The orphanage was an experiment," continued Williams, walking through the ballroom as if he were giving a lecture. "We selected children with extraordinary potential, molded their talents, created successors." "Guinea pigs," corrected Richard, his voice laden with contained anger. "We were guinea pigs for your manipulations." "You should be grateful," retorted Augustus. "I transformed you into what you are today, just as I was transforming my grandson Ryan." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. The aptitude tests at the orphanage, the piano. You were recreating the experiment with him. "Ryan has an extraordinary gift," said Augustus, a flash of genuine pride crossing his expression. "As you had for business, Edward never understood the importance of what we were doing. He wanted to expose everything, destroy decades of research." "Where is my son?" interrupted a firm voice. Lucy was standing at the entrance to the ballroom, her eyes flashing with fury. By her side, Michael held a tablet, his small hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Williams," began Augustus, but Lucy cut him off. "Don't use that name," she said, advancing. "Not after what you did to Edward." Helen moved restlessly, her eyes alternating between Richard and Augustus. "Mr. Montgomery, there's something you need to know." "He already knows," interrupted Michael, his voice surprisingly mature for his age. "Dad left everything recorded." The boy turned the tablet, showing a video. It was Edward Williams, recorded on the night of his accident. His voice filled the ballroom. "If something happens to me, look for Richard Montgomery. He is living proof of what my father did. He and the other children of Project Prometheus." Augustus visibly paled. "How?" "The bear," explained Michael. "It didn't just have the key to the safe deposit box. It had a flash drive sewn inside. Ryan discovered it last week, but he didn't know what it was. He just followed the music." Richard felt a wave of understanding hit him. Ryan hadn't been taken. He had been lured, using the same method that Augustus used in the orphanage, to identify children with special talents. "Helen," called Richard, without taking his eyes off Augustus, "you don't owe him anything." The housekeeper took a step forward, tears streaming down her face. "He threatened my family, my daughter." "As he threatened mine," completed Lucy, "as he manipulated all the people around him, Augustus, but now it's over." A soft sound of piano began to play again, coming from an adjacent room. It was no longer the artificial melody. It was the pure, crystalline notes that only Ryan could create. "He's here," whispered Ethan, pulling Richard's hand toward the sound. Augustus made a move to follow, but Helen, in a sudden movement, blocked his path. "Enough," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "I won't participate in this anymore." Richard and Ethan ran toward the music, followed by Lucy and Michael. Behind them, they could hear Augustus's voice shouting something, but the sound of the piano overwhelmed everything, like a beacon guiding them through the darkness of the past toward a light that was beginning to shine on the horizon. In a smaller room adjacent to the main ballroom, they found Ryan sitting at the piano, his fingers dancing over the keys with the same naturalness as always. He showed no fear or anxiety. He was completely immersed in his music, creating a melody that seemed to weave its own story. "Ryan!" called Lucy, running to embrace her son. The boy smiled without stopping playing. "I knew you would find me," he said simply. "The music always shows the way." Michael and Ethan joined their brother on the piano bench, forming a small circle of protection around him. Richard observed the scene with a mixture of relief and growing understanding. The music had been both a trap and a salvation, exactly as it had been in his own childhood at the orphanage. "The children of Project Prometheus," he said, more to himself than to the others. "Each with a specific gift: music, mathematics, strategy." "Edward discovered everything," confirmed Lucy, still embracing her children. "The files, the experiments, the selected children. Augustus was recreating the project with a new generation." Helen appeared at the door, her posture firmer now that she had chosen her side. "The police are on their way," she informed them. "And I brought this." She extended an old folder, its pages yellowed by time. It was an orphanage file containing detailed photos and reports on each child in the project. Richard recognized his own record. Subject 23, exceptional capacity. For strategic analysis and leadership. "You were his pride," said Helen softly. "That's why he was so furious when you turned against him 20 years ago. His most successful project became his greatest threat." Ryan stopped playing, turning to Richard with his curious eyes. "Did you hear the music too?" Richard knelt beside the piano, coming to the boy's eye level. "In a different way," he replied. "Each of us heard something unique. That's how he found us, tested us." "But the music isn't his," interrupted Ryan with the disconcerting wisdom of a child. "The music is ours." At that moment, the sounds of sirens began to echo through the building. Richard's security team had already contained Augustus in the main ballroom, and now the authorities would take over the case. Years of manipulation and secret experiments would finally come to light. "What happens now?" asked Michael, always the most pragmatic of the triplets. Richard exchanged a look, with Lucy before responding. "Now you're safe, all of us are." "Can we keep living in the penthouse?" asked Ethan hopefully. "There's so much more space to play there." A genuine smile illuminated Richard's face. "If your mother agrees." Lucy observed her children, Michael with his analytical gaze, Ethan with his tireless energy, and Ryan with his unique musical gift. Each of them special in their own way, but not as part of an experiment. Special simply for being who they were. "I think we can consider that," she replied, smiling as well. Helen discreetly cleared her throat. "I'll need help reorganizing the apartment for 5 people," she commented, her practical tone barely disguising the affection in her voice. Ryan turned back to the piano, playing some soft notes. The melody was different now, no longer Augustus's hypnotic call, but something new, something that spoke of new beginnings and possibilities. Richard felt something in his pocket, the old photo of the orphanage that Michael had found. Looking at it now, he no longer saw just the shadows of the past. He saw a reminder of how the most difficult circumstances can lead to the most meaningful encounters. Outside, the city continued its frantic rhythm, indifferent to the small drama, unfolding in the basement of one of its many skyscrapers. But inside that room, to the sound of Ryan's piano, a new family was beginning to form, not through experiments or manipulation, but by choice, by care, by love. The music continued, and now it was a melody of liberation. The following weeks brought significant changes to Richard Montgomery's penthouse. What was once a space marked by meticulous order and silence now pulsed with a different energy. The once empty corridors echoed with children's laughter, animated conversations, and, of course, the constant music from the piano. Helen had dedicated herself to the transformation of the apartment with surprising enthusiasm. The guest room was converted into a cheerful space for the triplets, with 3 beds strategically arranged, Michael near the bookshelf, Ethan by the window with a view of the city, and Ryan next to a digital keyboard that Richard had bought, especially for him. On that particular morning, Richard observed from his office as Lucy helped the boys with their new routines. She had reinstated her law license and begun working part-time in the legal department of Richard's company, balancing her return to the profession with caring for her children. "The piano teacher will arrive in half an hour," reminded Helen. entering the office with a cup of coffee. "And the investigator is waiting on line 3. Richard nodded, picking up the phone. The investigations into Project Prometheus were advancing, revealing a complex network of influence and manipulation that extended over decades. Each new discovery helped explain more about his own past and that of other children who had passed through the orphanage. "Montgomery," he said on the phone, his professional voice masking his inner tension. "We found more files," informed the voice on the other end. "There were other orphanages, other similar projects. The reach was greater than we imagined." Richard made some notes while listening to the report. In the background, he could hear Ryan practicing his scales on the piano, a routine that the boy had established on his own without any imposition. "And what about the other children?" he asked, thinking of the faces in the old photograph. "We're locating each one of them. Some have become prominent figures in their fields, scientists, artists, businessmen, all shaped by the program, like you." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Michael carrying a book almost bigger than himself. "Uncle Richard," he called. The title had emerged naturally in the last few weeks. "Can you help me with this? It's about architecture, and there are some words I don't understand." "I'll call back later," Richard told the investigator, hanging up the phone. "Come here, Michael. What words are those?" The boy settled into one of the office armchairs, opening the book with reverential care. His interest in architecture had revealed itself in the last few weeks, especially after discovering Richard's extensive collection of books on the subject. "Art Deco," read Michael, furrowing his brow. "And there's this other one here, modernism." Richard began to explain the terms, using elements of his own office as examples. Helen, who observed the scene from the door, smiled discreetly before withdrawing. In the hallway, she found Ethan organizing a sort of art exhibition with drawings made by the 3 brothers. The boy had developed a natural talent for curation, deciding exactly where each work should go to tell a coherent story. "It's looking nice," praised Helen, helping him align one of the drawings. "It's for Mum," explained Ethan. "She's been sad looking at the news about Grandpa, so I thought I'd do something to cheer her up." Helen felt her heart tighten. News about Augustus Williams and Project Prometheus had dominated the newspapers in recent weeks. Although Lucy tried to protect the boys from the heaviest information, it was impossible to completely hide the impact that the revelations had on the whole family. In the living room, Lucy was on the phone with her former law school professor, discussing the possibility of teaching in a social project for underprivileged children, a way to transform her own experience into something positive for others. Ryan, who had taken a break from his practice, sat down beside his mother with his music notebook. He had begun to create his own compositions, small melodies that seemed to capture the essence of the moments they were living. "This one is for Uncle Richard," he said, showing a music sheet with his childish handwriting. "It's called New Family." Lucy hugged her son, touched by the sensitivity he displayed. The last few weeks had been intense, with testimonies to the police, meetings with lawyers, and a flood of painful memories being relived. But amid all this turbulence, something beautiful and unexpected had blossomed. From his office, Richard heard the conversation while continuing to explain architectural concepts to Michael. His meticulously planned routine had been completely transformed, and surprisingly, he didn't miss the old order. He had discovered that there were other types of order, other rhythms of life that could be equally meaningful. The sound of the piano started again, Ryan now playing his new composition. The melody was simple but profound, carrying in its notes the story of how strangers can become family, of how the wounds of the past can be healed by the care of the present. Fall arrived in New York City, bringing winds of change. The penthouse, once a space of calculated solitude, had been transformed into a true home. The walls that once reflected only Richard's professional success now displayed the children's drawings, photographs of shared moments, and even some music, sheets composed by Ryan. On that specific afternoon, the living room had been transformed into a small improvised auditorium. It was the day of Ryan's first performance with his piano teacher, an event that had mobilized the entire family. Helen had organized a small cocktail party. Michael had helped arrange the chairs in a semicircle, and Ethan had insisted on creating handmade invitations for each guest. "Are you nervous?" asked Richard, finding Ryan practicing his last notes before the presentation. The boy shook his head negatively. "The music is already in here," he replied, touching his own chest. "I just need to let it out." Richard smiled, recognizing in that childish wisdom something that he himself was learning. Sometimes the greatest truths come from the most unexpected sources. Lucy entered the room, elegantly dressed for the occasion. In the last few weeks, she had regained not only her professional confidence, but also a serenity that she seemed to have lost a long time ago. "The first guests are arriving," she announced, adjusting the bow tie that Ryan had insisted on wearing. "And there's a special surprise." Through the main door entered several people whom Richard recognized from the old orphanage photos. They were other products of Project Prometheus, each carrying their own story of overcoming. There was a famous violinist, an award-winning mathematician, an internationally recognized visual artist, all connected by the same dark past, but now gathered to celebrate something new. "You found them," Richard said to Helen, who observed the scene with evident satisfaction. "Actually, they found us," replied the housekeeper. "After the story came to light, many wanted to establish contact. I thought it would be appropriate for today." Michael and Ethan circulated among the guests, clearly fascinated by the stories each had to tell. The mathematician showed number tricks to Michael, while the artist discussed color techniques with Ethan. "It's strange," commented Lucy, standing beside Richard, "how something so dark can lead to such luminous moments." "Sometimes we need darkness to recognize light," he replied, surprising himself with his own philosophy. The piano teacher arrived and everyone took their places. Ryan sat at the piano with surprising composure for his age. His small hands rested on the keys, and for a moment there was an expectant silence. The music that began to flow was his own composition, New Family, now arranged with the help of his teacher. The notes told a story that everyone there could understand. A story of losses and encounters, of pain and healing, of solitude and connection. Richard observed the faces around him as the music filled the environment. He saw tears in the eyes of some of the former orphans, smiles on the faces of Michael and Ethan, pride in Lucy's countenance. Helen, discreet as always, had a special gleam in her gaze. Ryan's music was like an invisible thread that connected everyone present there, transforming a group of strangers united by a painful past into a new form of family, a chosen family, built on understanding and mutual acceptance. When the last notes dissipated in the air, there was a moment of reverent silence before the applause began. Ryan stood up and made a small bow, exactly as his teacher had taught him, but his eyes sought first Richard and Lucy, seeking their approval. What he found was much more than that. It was the gaze of people who had learned that family is not just a matter of blood or documents, but of daily choices, of small gestures of care, of shared music and interwoven stories. "Now it is," whispered Ryan, sitting back at the piano for an encore. "Complete." And as a new melody began to be born under his fingers, Richard realized that the boy was right. His life, which for so long had been an incomplete symphony, finally found its perfect harmony. The New York winter brought with it a soft mist that enveloped the skyscrapers like a silver mantle. In the penthouse, the aroma of hot chocolate, prepared by Helen, mingled with the sound of the triplets' laughter, who were playing in the living room, transformed into a fort of pillows. Richard observed the scene from his favorite armchair, a forgotten book in his lap. In the last few weeks, his business empire had faced significant challenges due to the revelations about Project Prometheus, but surprisingly, that seemed less important now. "Still working on the reports?" asked Lucy, sitting in the armchair beside him. She had just returned from court, where she now worked on cases related to children's and adolescents' rights. "Actually, I was thinking about something different," replied Richard, his eyes fixed on the boys. "I've been talking with some of the other survivors of the project. We want to create a foundation." Lucy leaned forward, interested. "What kind of foundation?" "One that does the opposite of what Augustus did," he explained. "Instead of manipulating talents for his own benefit, We want to identify children with special gifts and give them and their families the necessary support to develop naturally. In the center of the room, Ryan had left the game to sit at the piano. His small hands began to play a new melody, something that seemed to perfectly match the welcoming atmosphere of that winter afternoon. "It's a wonderful idea," said Helen, who was approaching with a tray of hot chocolate. "And I think we already have our first case studies." Michael looked up from the architecture book he was leafing through. "Can we help other children like us?" "What do you mean, like us?" asked Ethan, joining the conversation. "Special," replied Michael with simplicity. "But special in our own way, not in the way Grandpa wanted." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. The wisdom of that 5-year-old child was disconcerting. "Exactly, Michael. Each person is special in their own way." Lucy observed her children with moist eyes. In the last few weeks, they had flourished in unexpected ways. Michael was increasingly interested in architecture and design, spending hours drawing plans of imaginary houses. Ethan had revealed a natural talent for visual arts, transforming the walls of his room into a constantly evolving gallery. And Ryan? Well, his music spoke for itself. "I already have a name for the foundation," said Richard, taking his cup of hot chocolate. "Project Phoenix." "Because it's about rising from the ashes?" asked Helen, a small smile on her lips. "Because it's about transforming pain into possibility," he corrected gently. Ryan stopped playing for a moment, turning on the piano bench. "Can I compose music for the foundation?" "Of course you can," replied Richard. "In fact, I was thinking of starting with a cultural center, a place where children can explore music, art, science, anything that fascinates them." "In the old orphanage," suggested Lucy, immediately understanding the symbolism. Richard nodded. "The building has been abandoned for years. We can transform it into something new, something good." Michael was already running to get his drawing notebook. "Can I do the project? Well, try at least." "I'll help with the decoration," exclaimed Ethan, his eyes shining with ideas. Helen observed everything with a satisfied smile. In the last few months, she had witnessed the complete transformation not only of the apartment, but of all the people who lived there. The lonely and controlling man who was her boss had become someone capable of smiling, of playing, of loving. "You know what's most amazing?" she commented, helping Ethan organize his colored pencils. "How sometimes the worst experiences can lead us to the best places." Richard looked around the room, at Michael concentrated on his architectural drawings, at Ethan planning his next work of art, at Ryan returning to playing the piano, at Lucy smiling with a peace that seemed impossible a few months ago. "It's not the places," he replied, his voice soft. "It's the people we find along the way." Ryan's music filled the environment again, a melody that seemed to carry in its notes the entire story of that improvised family. Outside, the mist was beginning to dissipate, revealing a surprisingly blue sky for a winter day in New York City. Spring arrived in New York City, bringing with it renewed energy. The old orphanage, now under full renovation, was beginning to gain new life under Richard's attentive supervision and the enthusiastic collaboration of the triplets. The grey walls that had previously witnessed so many manipulations were now being dressed in vibrant colors, carefully chosen by Ethan. On that particular morning, the entire family had gathered at the site to monitor the progress of the works. Michael walked through the corridors with a simplified floor plan in his hands, checking if each space corresponded to his childish but surprisingly accurate vision. "The music studio will be here," he explained, pointing to a large room. "Ryan said it needs good acoustics." Richard observed with admiration how the boy had absorbed architectural terms and concepts in such a short time. "And have you decided where the art gallery will be?" "Ethan wants it to be near the garden," replied Michael, consulting his notes. "He says natural light is important for colors." Lucy, who had just arrived from a meeting with other lawyers for the project, smiled when she saw her children so involved. She herself was coordinating the legal part of the foundation, ensuring that all children who would benefit from the program had their rights fully protected. "Helen called," she said to Richard. 3 more families from Project Prometheus have made contact. They want to participate in the foundation. Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and responsibility. What had begun as a form of personal redemption was transforming into a larger movement, uniting people who shared not only a painful past, but also the desire to transform it into something positive. In the building's inner courtyard, Ryan was sitting on an improvised bench, composing in his music notebook. Beside him, a group of neighborhood children, who had already discovered that something special was happening there, watched, fascinated. "Can you teach us to play?" asked one of the girls. Ryan raised his eyes from his music sheet, smiling. "When the studio is ready, everyone will be able to learn," he replied, his voice soft but confident. Helen, who had arrived bringing snacks for everyone, stopped to observe the scene. "He's becoming more and more communicative," she commented to Richard. "Everyone is changing," he replied, "including me." Indeed, Richard's transformation was visible to anyone who knew him before. The man who once measured every minute of his day and calculated every human interaction now allowed himself moments of spontaneity, of affection, of simplicity. Ethan approached running, his hands stained with paint. "Uncle Richard, come see. I finished the entrance mural." The mural was an explosion of colors and shapes that somehow told the story of the foundation. There were elements representing music, architecture, art, and science, all intertwined in a composition that, although created by childish hands, carried a surprising depth. "It's about transformation," explained Ethan, pointing to different parts of the mural. "Like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, or like a lonely man turning into family," completed Lucy softly, intertwining her fingers with Richard's. The moment was interrupted by sounds of laughter and music. Ryan had begun to play on a portable keyboard, and the neighborhood children were dancing around him. Michael joined the group, excitedly explaining how that space would transform into a school of arts, while Ethan was already planning his next work. "You know what's most incredible?" said Helen, observing the scene. "How love can change not only the future but also the past." Richard understood exactly what she meant. The painful memories of the orphanage, Augustus's manipulations, all the suffering. None of it had disappeared. But now these experiences served as a foundation for something new and beautiful. "Edward would be proud," said Lucy, her voice choked with emotion. "He always said that the true legacy he wanted to leave for the boys was the ability to transform the world." "And they're doing exactly that," replied Richard, "each in their own way." Ryan's music floated through the courtyard, mixing with the sounds of the renovation, with the children's laughter, with the rustling of new leaves in the garden trees. It was a symphony of new beginnings, of hope, of family. On the top floor, Michael had found a perfect location for what he called the dream room, a space where other children could discover and develop their own talents, not through manipulation or pressure, but with freedom and support. The day of the Phoenix Cultural Center's inauguration dawned with an extraordinarily blue sky. The old orphanage, completely renovated, gleamed under the sunlight, its once grey walls now alive with murals by Ethan and other young artists from the community. Richard adjusted his tie in front of the mirror in his bedroom at the penthouse, while listening to the animated buzz coming from the living room. The last few months had been intense, with the building's renovation, the foundation's structuring, and mainly the adaptation to a life that now overflowed with affection and meaning. "Are you nervous?" asked Helen, entering the room with a bow tie for Ryan. "Curious," he replied, smiling slightly. "I never imagined I would be doing something like this." In the hallway, the triplets were already ready, each in their own particular way. Michael wore a miniature suit that he had chosen himself, with a notepad in his pocket to record all the details of the day. Ethan had opted for more artistic clothing, with a colorful vest that matched the cultural center's main mural. Ryan, elegant in his formal outfit, held a folder with sheet music. He would be one of the main attractions at the inauguration ceremony. "Mom looks beautiful," announced Ethan, running down the hall. Lucy emerged from her room wearing a navy blue dress that enhanced her natural elegance. In the last few months, she had become not just a partner in the foundation, but a fundamental presence in Richard's life. Their relationship had evolved naturally, like a melody that had always existed but only now found its complete expression. "The first guests are already arriving," informed Helen, consulting her tablet, "and the press is positioned." The inauguration of the Phoenix Cultural Center had attracted considerable media attention, not just for the transformation of the old orphanage, but mainly for the story behind the project. Several former participants of Project Prometheus would be present, each bringing their own contribution to the new endeavor. "Uncle Richard," called Ryan, his voice soft but determined, "can I show you something before we go?" Richard followed, the boy to the living room piano. Ryan sat at the instrument and began to play a new composition. It was different from everything he had created until then, a complex piece that seemed to tell the entire story of that improvised family, from the meeting in the rain to that moment. "It's to play at the inauguration," explained Ryan. "I called it Metamorphosis." Lucy, who had approached to listen, had tears in her eyes. "It's perfect, my love." "It has parts for all of us," continued Ryan, pointing to different sections of the music sheet. "This stronger part is Uncle Richard before he found us. Then it becomes softer but also more complex." Michael and Ethan joined their brother on the piano bench, each recognizing the elements that represented their own stories in the composition. Helen observed the scene with an emotional smile, remembering how that penthouse, once so silent, had been transformed into a true home. "It's time," she announced softly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but aware of the schedule. The group descended to the building's lobby, where an executive van awaited them. During the journey to the cultural center, Richard observed the city through the window, recalling that rainy morning that had changed everything. How was it possible that just a few months separated him from that lonely and controlling man he used to be? Upon arriving at the cultural center, they were received by a small crowd. Children from the neighborhood, who had already enrolled in the first courses offered, waved enthusiastically. Several of the former orphans from Project Prometheus, now successful adults, conversed among themselves, sharing stories and plans for the future. The building, with its historical architecture preserved but renovated, seemed to pulse with possibilities. Each space had been carefully planned to nurture natural talents without ever forcing them. The library, the music studio, the art and science rooms, everything was ready to receive a new generation of dreamers. "Look," exclaimed Ethan, pointing to the sky. A small rainbow had formed, even without rain, creating a colorful arc over the building. "It's a sign," said Michael, always the most analytical, "that we're on the right path." Richard felt Ryan's small hand hold his, while Lucy intertwined her fingers on the other side. Helen, a few steps behind, smiled with maternal approval. Together they walked toward the entrance of the cultural center, where a new story was about to begin. The auditorium of the Phoenix Cultural Center was full, a sea of attentive and expectant faces. On stage, Richard remained silent for a moment, observing the diverse audience that had gathered for the inauguration. There were children from the neighborhood, entire families, journalists, authorities, and most significantly, several former participants of Project Prometheus. "A year ago," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion, "I believed that success meant control, that power meant isolation, that security meant distance. I was completely wrong." His eyes found Lucy in the first row, seated between Michael and Ethan. Ryan was close to the piano on the stage, waiting for his moment to play. This cultural center is born not only as an educational and developmental institution, but as a testimony that the most painful stories can be transformed into something beautiful, that the traumas of the past can become bridges to a better future. In the audience, Helen discreetly wiped away a tear, while observing the emotional expressions of the other ex-orphans. Each of them carried their own scars from Project Prometheus, but now those marks served as maps to help others find their own paths. "Each room in this building," continued Richard, "was designed to nurture natural talents, not to force them, to celebrate differences, not to standardize them, to build bridges, not walls." Michael leafed through his notebook of notes, where he had recorded each step of the building's transformation. Ethan proudly admired the murals that decorated the walls, each telling a different part of the story. And Ryan, seated at the piano, patiently awaited his moment to give voice to all of that through music. "But the true transformation," proceeded Richard, "is not in these renovated walls or in the programs we will develop. It's in the connections we create, in the families we form, in the bonds we build when we allow ourselves to be touched by the lives of others." Lucy smiled, remembering that rainy morning that had changed everything. How could she have imagined, in that moment of despair, that she was walking toward her salvation? "And now," said Richard, his gaze softening, "I would like to introduce someone who has taught me more about music, love, and courage than any book or course ever could. Ryan?" The boy stood up and walked to the piano with serene confidence. His small hands rested on the keys, and the first chords of Metamorphosis filled the auditorium. The music began with low, solitary notes, portraying the isolation that both Richard and Lucy had lived through. Gradually, new elements were introduced: the cheerful voices of the triplets, Helen's constant presence, the small moments of discovery and connection. The audience listened in reverent silence, many with tears in their eyes, recognizing in each note their own journeys of transformation. The neighborhood children seated in the front rows watched fascinated how someone as young as them could create something so profound. When the last chord sounded, there was a moment of absolute silence before the applause began. Ryan stood up and made a small bow, his eyes seeking first his family, all of them those by blood and those that destiny had brought. Richard returned to the microphone for the final words. "This cultural center is open not just for classes and activities, but for dreams, for possibilities, for new beginnings." Michael and Ethan ran to the stage, joining their brother. Lucy and Helen followed them, and for a moment, all were together under the stage lights, an improvised family that had become more real than any traditional arrangement. Outside, the city continued its frantic rhythm, but within those renovated walls, something special had begun. The old shadows of Project Prometheus had been transformed into light, fears into hope, solitude into connection. And as people began to explore the cultural center's facilities, Richard observed everything with a new understanding. True power wasn't in control or isolation, but in the capacity to open oneself to the unexpected, to allow love to transform not only the future, but also heal the past. Ryan returned to the piano, this time accompanied by other curious children eager to learn. His music continued to fill the environment, no longer a solitary melody, but part of a greater symphony, the symphony of intertwined lives, of open hearts, of possible futures. 6 months after the inauguration of the Phoenix Cultural Center, life had found a new rhythm. Richard's penthouse, once a monument to organized solitude, now pulsed with a different energy on Sunday mornings. The aroma of fresh coffee and homemade bread prepared by Helen mingled with the sound of Ryan's piano, who was practicing for his first formal presentation as a music teacher at the Cultural Center. "I can't believe he's going to teach," commented Lucy, observing her youngest son with pride as she served breakfast. "It seems like it was yesterday that he could barely talk to strangers." Richard smiled, lowering the newspaper he was reading. The headlines were no longer about scandals or investigations, but about the success of the Phoenix Cultural Center's artistic development program. "He's not the only one who's surprising," he said, pointing to a specific page in the newspaper. In the culture section, there was an article about the Cultural Center's first children's art exhibition, organized by Ethan. The boy had not only curated the exhibition, but also helped other young artists find their own creative voices. His works, displayed side by side with those of other neighborhood children, told stories of transformation and hope. Michael entered the room, carrying his latest creation, a detailed model of a new space he had designed for the Cultural Center. "We can build a special area for astronomy," he explained, his eyes shining with enthusiasm, "with a small observatory." Helen, who had just brought another batch of bread, examined the model with genuine interest. "You've thought of everything, haven't you? You even put access ramps and natural lighting." "I learned from the best," replied Michael, casting an affectionate look at Richard. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. It was Clara, one of the former participants of Project Prometheus, now a renowned scientist who had become a volunteer at the Cultural Center. She brought news about a special program they were developing. The registrations for the mentoring program have already exceeded our expectations, she announced, accepting a cup of coffee. We have more than 50 former participants of the project wanting to help other children develop their talents naturally. Richard observed as Clara showed the preliminary reports. The mentoring program was a crucial part of the foundation, connecting adults who had survived Project Prometheus with children who demonstrated similar talents. But unlike the past, the focus now was on healthy development and emotional support. "Look at this," said Clara, showing some photographs on her tablet. "These are from our first science workshop." The photos showed children of different ages conducting experiments, their faces illuminated by discovery. In one of them, Michael appeared explaining basic architectural concepts to a group of interested youngsters. "And it's not just in science," she continued. "Ryan's music program already has a waiting list, and Ethan's art classes." She was interrupted by the sound of the piano. Ryan had begun to play a new composition. The melody was different from anything he had created before, more mature and complex, but still carrying that emotional purity that characterized him. "This is new," commented Lucy, approaching the piano. "Does it have a name?" Ryan continued playing as he responded. "It's called Horizons. It's about how the future is always changing, always surprising us." Ethan, who had been quietly drawing in his corner, stood up to show his newest work, a drawing that perfectly captured the present moment. The family gathered at breakfast, sunlight entering through the windows, the piano in the background, each person in their own activity, but all connected by invisible bonds of affection. "Can we hang it at the Cultural Center?" he asked. "In the Gallery of New Stories?" "Gallery of New Stories?" questioned Clara, curious. "It's a special space," explained Michael, always ready to share information, "for works that show how people can change, grow, find new paths." Helen, who observed everything with her always attentive gaze, noticed how Richard and Lucy had naturally drawn closer, their hands finding each other without them realizing it. It was a small gesture, but significant, a symbol of how love can flourish in the most unexpected places. "You know," said Clara, preparing to leave, "when you first proposed transforming the old orphanage into a cultural center, many doubted. They thought it was impossible to transform a place with so many painful memories into something positive. And what do they say now?" asked Richard, although he already knew the answer. "Now they understand," she replied, smiling. "Sometimes you need to revisit the past, not to be stuck in it, but to create a different future." Ryan finished his music with a soft chord that seemed to linger in the air like a promise. The Sunday sun continued to bathe the room with its golden light, while the city outside began to awaken. It was a new day, with new horizons opening, not just for that improvised family, but for all the lives they were helping to transform. Night was falling gently over New York City when Richard found the envelope on his desk in the penthouse office. It was simple paper, but the content made his heart race. A summons to testify in the case against Augustus Williams. After months of investigations, the case would finally reach the courts. "Have you received yours too?" asked Lucy, entering the office. She carried her own envelope, identical to his. "I just opened it," replied Richard, his voice calm, masking the storm of emotions he felt. "How are the boys?" "Ryan is at the Cultural Center giving his piano lesson. Michael and Ethan went with Helen to visit the new exhibition being set up," she explained, sitting in the armchair across from the desk. The silence that followed was comfortable, full of mutual understanding. Both knew that the process would be difficult, that they would have to relive painful memories, but they also understood that it was necessary to complete the healing cycle they had initiated. "I found this today," said Richard, opening a drawer and removing an old photograph. It was from the day of the orphanage's inauguration, decades ago. Augustus Williams smiled at the camera, surrounded by children he intended to transform into his masterpieces. He really believed he was doing something good, commented Lucy, studying the photo. That's the scariest part. That's why the Phoenix Cultural Center is so important, replied Richard, to show that there is a different way to nurture talents, to create opportunities. The sound of the elevator announced the arrival of the boys with Helen. Ethan entered first, carrying a new set of drawings. Michael followed him, animatedly discussing the possibilities for expanding the art gallery. Helen, as always, supervised everything with her attentive and affectionate gaze. "Look what I made!" exclaimed Ethan, spreading his drawings on Richard's desk. They were portraits of the family, not just theirs, but also of the other families that frequented the cultural center. Each drawing captured something special, a unique connection between the people portrayed. "And I developed a project to create more music rooms," added Michael, showing his own sketchbook. "Ryan said we need different spaces for different instruments." Helen smiled, observing how Richard and Lucy naturally came together to examine the boys' creations. "Speaking of Ryan, he sent a message. He's going to be a bit late. The students asked him to teach one more song." "He's flourishing as a teacher," commented Lucy, proud. "Who would have thought that shy boy would become so confident?" "We've all changed," replied Richard, his gaze traveling over each face in the room, "in ways we could never have imagined." Ethan, who had approached the window, called everyone's attention. "Look, it's starting to rain." Indeed, a gentle rain was beginning to fall on the city, very similar to the one that had united their lives a little over a year ago. But now, instead of separation and fear, the rain brought a sense of renewal and possibility. "You know what this reminds me of?" asked Helen, heading to the kitchen. "I think it's a good night for hot chocolate." While Helen prepared the beverage, the sound of the elevator announced Ryan's arrival. He entered the room with his music notebook, his face illuminated by the enthusiasm of another day of teaching. "How was the class, Professor?" joked Richard. "Amazing," replied Ryan, sitting at the piano. "Today, one of the students managed to play an entire song alone for the first time. You should have seen her smile." His hands began to gently finger the keys, creating a melody that seemed to perfectly match the sound of the rain outside. Michael and Ethan joined their brother, each bringing their own projects and dreams to share. Richard observed the scene with Lucy by his side, their hands naturally intertwined. Helen returned with the hot chocolate, distributing the cups with the loving efficiency that characterized her. "Tomorrow will be a big day," said Lucy softly, referring to the beginning of the judicial process. "Yes," agreed Richard. "But we're no longer alone." Ryan's music filled the environment, mixing with the sound of the rain, with the animated conversations of the boys, with the clinking of hot chocolate cups. It was a symphony of family, of love, of new beginnings, living proof that sometimes the greatest blessings can come disguised as challenges, and that true power isn't in control, but in the capacity to open oneself to the unexpected. The New York Supreme Court imposed a solemnity that made the heart tighten. Richard adjusted his tie while waiting in the hallway, alongside Lucy and other former participants of Project Prometheus. Each of them carried their own story of overcoming, about to be revealed to transform the future of other children. Helen had stayed in the penthouse with the triplets, although Ryan had insisted on composing special music for the day. "To give courage," he had said, handing the sheet music to Richard that morning. The notes, written in his childish but precise handwriting, were now folded in the pocket of his suit jacket, like a talisman. "Mr. Williams has already arrived," informed one of the lawyers approaching the group. "They're ready to begin." Lucy held Richard's hand, a gesture that had become natural in the last few months. "Together?" she asked. "Always," he replied, feeling the paper with Ryan's music in his pocket. The courtroom was full. Journalists, lawyers, human rights organization, representatives, and, most significantly, several of the former orphans of the project occupied the available seats. In front, Augustus Williams sat with his lawyers, his posture still haughty despite the circumstances. When Richard was called to testify, the silence in the room was palpable. He walked to the stand, feeling the weight of decades of history on his shoulders. But instead of crushing him, this weight now strengthened him. "Please, Mr. Montgomery," began the judge, "tell us about your experience in Project Prometheus." Richard took a deep breath, his hands lightly touching the paper in his pocket. "I was 9 years old when I was selected," he began. "At the time, it seemed like a miracle. A powerful and respected man had chosen me, saying I had extraordinary potential." His eyes met Augustus's for a moment. The old businessman maintained his impassive expression, but something in his gaze had changed. "What we didn't understand," continued Richard, "was the price of this miracle. We were separated from any possibility of real emotional connection. Our talents weren't nurtured, they were exploited. We weren't children, we were investments." A murmur ran through the room. Some of the other former orphans nodded, recognizing their own story in Richard's words. But the worst wasn't the intensive training, the constant tests, or even the isolation, he proceeded. The worst was the subliminal message we received, that our value was only in our utility, that love and connection were weaknesses, that success meant solitude. Lucy, seated in the first row, had tears in her eyes. She more than anyone understood the impact of these words, having seen Richard's transformation in recent months. "The project shaped us, yes," admitted Richard. "It made us exceptionally successful in our fields. I built a business empire. Clara became a renowned scientist. John is an internationally acclaimed musician. But at what cost?" He paused, removing the sheet music from his pocket. "This morning, I received this from Ryan, a 5-year-old boy who has taught me more about music, love, and courage than all the years of training in the project." Augustus shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on the paper Richard was holding. "What Project Prometheus didn't understand," continued Richard, "is that true excellence doesn't come from isolation, but from connection, not from manipulation, but from the freedom to discover who we really are." He then detailed how the project worked, how children were selected, how their talents were identified and exploited. He spoke of the methods of emotional control, the constant pressure, the fear of failure that haunted them. But he also spoke of redemption, of the Phoenix Cultural Center, and how it was helping other children develop their talents naturally, with emotional support and respect for their individualities. "What I ask of this court," he concluded, "is not just justice for the past, but protection for the future, so that no other child is treated as an experiment, so that no talent is developed at the cost of the soul." When he finished his testimony, the silence in the room was different from the initial one. It was no longer tense or apprehensive, but laden with understanding and possibility. As he returned to his seat, Richard passed by Augustus. The old businessman looked at him with a complex expression. There was still pride there, but now mixed with something that looked like regret. "You were always the best of them," whispered Augustus almost inaudibly, "but not in the way I expected." Richard paused for a moment. "No," he replied softly. "I'm better in the way I chose to be." Lucy would be the next to testify, and as she prepared, Richard unfolded Ryan's sheet music. The melody in his mind mingled with the voices in the room, with the sound of truth finally being revealed, with the whisper of a different future taking shape on the horizon. The sun was setting over New York City, painting the sky with tones of orange and pink. When the family returned to the penthouse after the last day of the trial, Helen awaited them with the triplets, who had transformed the living room into a small celebration stage, with drawings, posters, and of course music. "So it's over?" asked Ryan, seated at the piano, his small hands ready to play. "Yes, my love," replied Lucy, embracing her son. "It's over." The sentence had been clear. Augustus Williams and all those involved in Project Prometheus would face the legal consequences of their actions. More importantly, all resources and properties related to the project would be converted into a fund to support the work of the Phoenix Cultural Center and similar initiatives. "It's not really an end," corrected Richard, loosening his tie. "It's more like a new beginning." Michael and Ethan ran to show what they had prepared during the day, a series of drawings and models representing their visions for the future of the Cultural Center. There were plans for new spaces, expanded programs, more ways to reach children with special talents. "Look," said Helen, bringing a tray with hot chocolate, a tradition that had become a symbol of important moments in the family. "It seems like it was just yesterday that you first arrived here." Ryan began to play softly, a melody that seemed to interweave all the stories they had lived through until now. The notes flowed like memories, the rainy morning of their first encounter, the discoveries about the past, the moments of fear and courage, the small daily victories, the shared smiles. "Is this music new?" asked Richard, approaching the piano. "I'm calling it family," replied Ryan without stopping playing. "Because it has parts for all of us." And it really did. There were strong and determined passages that reminded one of Richard, soft and welcoming parts that brought to mind Lucy, animated variations that captured Ethan's energy, structured sections that reflected Michael's precision, and background harmonies that echoed Helen's constant presence. "You know," said Lucy, sitting beside Richard, "when I got into that car that morning, I was desperate for shelter. I didn't imagine I would find a home." Richard smiled, observing how his children, because that's how he saw them now, filled the environment with their unique and complementary personalities. "I also didn't imagine that, trying to give shelter to you, I would find my own liberation." Helen served the hot chocolate, and everyone settled in to listen to Ryan play. Michael explained his new architectural projects, while Ethan showed the sketches for his next exhibition. The scene was so natural, so perfectly imperfect, that it seemed difficult to remember how their lives were before. "What happens now?" asked Ethan, nestling between Richard and Lucy. "Now," replied Richard, "we continue writing our story together." Ryan finished his music with a soft chord that lingered in the air like a promise. Outside, the city was beginning to light up, thousands of bright points in the growing darkness. But there, in that penthouse that had been transformed into a true home, shone a different light, the light of love, of understanding, of the family they had built. "You know," said Helen, collecting the empty cups, "they say the best families aren't formed just by blood, but by love and choice." Michael, always the most reflective, added, "Like an orchestra, right? Each one plays a different instrument, but together we make music." Richard felt Lucy gently squeeze his hand, while Ryan began a new melody at the piano. Ethan was already drawing again, and Michael was leafing through his project notebook. Helen smiled, observing the scene with her maternal gaze. It was an image very different from that rainy morning a year ago. A lonely businessman in his luxurious car, a desperate mother protecting her children from the rain. Destiny, in its mysterious wisdom, had interwoven their lives in a way that none of them could have predicted. And there, on that special night, as Ryan's music echoed off the penthouse walls, they all understood a fundamental